All right, welcome everybody. For the sake of time, I'm just going to get us started, and I'm just going to give a couple details about this webinar before we pass it along to our presenters. My name is Lauren Lisi. I'm the manager of grants and research projects at the National Endowment for Financial Education. Thank you all so much for joining today. We're really excited to have Dr. Thomas Korankye and Yingying Zeng, two participants in the NEFE and Knology Fellowship program, here to present their work using Knology's database and mapping tool. Dr. Korankye is an assistant professor in personal and family financial planning at the University of Arizona Norton School of Human Ecology. And Yingying is a PhD candidate in social work at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. Just some details about today's webinar. We'll have each of our presenters present for about 15 to 20 minutes. We plan to save 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each presentation for Q&A and ask that you save any questions that you have for them until then. When the time comes, the best ways to ask a question are to either raise your hand virtually using the option in the bar at the bottom, and the host will unmute you to ask your question directly to our presenters. For that, we will unmute folks in the order that we received raised hands. Alternatively, you can also type questions into the chat box, and we will answer those in the order that they are received. Just to not distract our presenters, we do ask that you refrain from using the chat feature until then. I will also be dropping a link in the chat to a short survey at the end of the second Q&A time. This survey is meant to provide feedback on the webinar today, and we really value your thoughts and suggestions. It should take no more than a few minutes to complete, and we really appreciate you doing so. I think that's it from me. I'll pass it over to Sean Field from Knology to kick us off.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Field. I'm a researcher at Knology. Knology is a social science research think tank based in New York City, which with an aim of producing practical social science for a better world. Just a quick introduction to the project. In 2019, Knology won a research award from NEFE, which was called A New History of Investment in Financial Education Across the United States, where we aim to assess the impact of financial education investment by states and nonprofits on individual behaviors. Through this project, we put together a database that Lauren mentioned that includes data on students' exposure to relevant academic content standards, as well as nonprofits' program service expenses and measures in the Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making, known as the SHED survey. Knology's original research plan focused on understanding the return on investment of state mandates for financial education by looking at individual economic security outcomes captured in the SHED survey. The database was then put to use by 6 fellows in 2022, each of whom have taken a different approach to understanding the impacts of mandates, frameworks, and public and private investment on financial decision-making. You'll hear from 2 of those fellows today. And with apologies, I do need to head out around 5 p.m. today, but after the webinar is complete, I will make sure to send out an email to all of those in attendance with resources, including how to access the database, our spending mapping tool, and a webinar discussing how you can use the database for yourself for your research. It is publicly accessible. So thanks all, and I'll kick it over to Yingying.
Sure. Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction, and thank you, Sean. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar. And my name is Yingying Zeng. I am currently a PhD candidate in social work at Washington University in St. Louis. I will be joining the University of Georgia this fall as assistant professor. And I really appreciate the opportunity that provided by NEFE to explore the state financial education spending data with the support by Knology. So my topic for today is financial education, gender, and use of alternative financial services among U.S. young adults, a multi-level modeling approach. I'm now developing this study into a manuscript for journal publication, and I also invited Dr. Lu Fang, another fellow in my cohort, to join me to work on this project together. Okay, first, I want to talk about the background of this study. Alternative financial services are generally described as an array of financial products and services delivered by non-bank providers, such as payday loans, partial loans, check cashing, and so forth. While AFS provides credit options to those who have limited access to mainstream financial services, the expensive costs of using these services put a great financial burden on consumers. Nevertheless, over 1 out of 4 American adults reported using these services. Among those who use AFS, approximately 46% are young adults between 18 and 34. As we know that young adulthood is a very important time across one's life cycle. So developing healthy financial behaviors is essential to young adults because young adulthood sets the stage for financial security in later life. To help young people avoid making financial mistakes, some states have established a variety of financial education programs for middle and high school students. Some states set standalone requirements classes, while others set embedded requirements financial classes. So figure 1 and 2 show the fraction of students in schools with standalone and embedded course requirements, respectively. As you can see in these 2 maps, no matter what kind of requirements in states, state level variations exist in financial education, and these variations are highly related to the resources that are available for school financial education. So my question is, will state-level financial education investment explain variations in young adults' use of AFS? To answer this question, I conducted some literature review, and my literature review mainly included 2 parts. First is who uses AFS, and second is the relationship between financial education and young adults' financial behavior. I also look at gender differences in financial education outcomes because gender issue appears in the financial education studies. Okay, who uses AFS? Research demonstrates that consumers with lower financial literacy or less financial knowledge are more likely to use AFS. The propensity to use AFS is greater among young adults, females, non-white, those with lower education, and with financial hardship. Research showed that financial education decreases young adults' reliance on non-student debt and improves repay behavior. High school financial education reduces young adults' likelihood and the frequency of payday borrowing through increased financial literacy and improved financial planning practices. In 2020, Urban et al. Focuses on the policy level, and they found that implementation of financial education policy matters. States with enhanced implementation efforts are associated with stronger effects on young people's credit behaviors. Gender becomes a little bit interesting here because the findings are mixed. Burke et al. Find that school financial education improves the subjective financial well-being of men, but no such improvement for women. However, women who have financial education are objectively better off. Harvey finds that state-mandated financial education reduces the use of AFS for both men and women. So in summary, research on the correlates of AFS has largely focused on individual level characteristics with less attention to the role of state level factors. Although school-based financial education has been found to have positive effects on young adults' financial behaviors, states' efforts in designing and implementing vary, and this state level variation may be associated with differences in young adults' use of AFS. And lastly, it is unclear if financial education outcomes vary by gender. Therefore, this study has 2 purposes. First, to further our understanding of the relationship between state investment in school-based financial education and the young adults' use of AFS. Second, to examine if gender moderates the relationship between financial education and the young adults' use of AFS. Second method. In this study, I use study data from 2013 to 2019, and I restricted my analytic sample to young adults aged 25 to 30, and the total sample size is 5,820. The state level data was from public school spanning from 2001 to 2012. The dependent variable is the number of AFSUs, which was from study data. The dependent variable was generated using 4 questions asking the respondents about their use of one type of AFS services, and the answers were binary coded, and then I added these answers up to create a count variable ranging from 0 to 4. Individual level independent variables or level 1 independent variables were from study data, including gender, race, age, marital status, household size, number of children, education, employment status, and financial circumstances. The level 2 predictor was from public school spending, which was measured as average state financial education expenses per student from 2001 to 2012. The average spending ranged from 0 to about 49, with a mean of about $12. The median spending is about $10. Based on the distribution, I categorized the states into 3 categories. I defined the low investment financial education investment state if they spend less than $10 per student. Median level investment refers to those spend from $10 to $20. And the state with high investment refers to those who spend more than $20 per student. In this study, I used multi-level mixed effect negative binomial regression because the outcome variable is the count variable. I also compare that with a Poisson regression, but the likelihood ratio test shows that the negative binomial model works better. So I basically ran 4 models. The model 0, the non-model, is to examine if the state level variations exist and if it has explaining power. Then I added individual level and state level predictors to model 1 and model 2. And in model 3, I added the interaction term to test the moderation effect of gender. And let's see what I found in this study. Descriptive findings show that 27% of the respondents at least used one of AFS products. Females are more likely to use all AFS except for payday loans. Non-Hispanic Blacks are most likely to use AFS, followed by Hispanics. Having one more child increases the number of AFS used by 28%. Being employed decreases the number of AF used by 36%. And this map virtually shows the average spending on each student by state. So the darker color means higher state level financial education spending per student. So you can see that in this map, state level variations exist, and some states like Colorado, Wisconsin, and Utah, they spend a high level on the students' financial education, while other states like Texas and Mississippi spend less on students' financial education. And this figure shows the bivariate analysis between mean spending and the average use of AFS, and you can see that the state level financial education spending is negatively correlated with the average AFS use. And there is a striking pattern here. So you can see that in states with high level spending investment on students' financial education, young adults' use of AFS is lower. So The non-model with a likelihood ratio test comparing the model with the standard negative binomial model favors the random intercept model, indicating that there is a significant variation in the use of AFS between states. And this table shows the regression results from the 3 models with predictors. And the numbers here are incident rate ratio. And the number greater than 1 means the higher risk of using AFS. And the number between 0 and 1 means the less risk of using AFS. So I will not go into these numbers one by one, but I want to show you that the first part are the results of the individual level characteristics. And here I want to highlight these findings. As you can see, so states with high spending on school financial education, young adults have less risk of using AFS. And here in the model 3 for the interaction term, and we can see that high spending on financial education lower the risk of AFS use, but only for males. So I have 3 key findings here, and the first key finding is individual characteristics were significant predictors of AFS usage among young adults. Young adults who were female, non-white, had lower education, had a smaller family size with more children, and higher perceived financial hardship were more likely to use AFS. Second, and state level predictor, we can in this study I found that the state level financial education spending was significantly associated with AFS use of young adults after controlling for individual factors. The risk of using AFS decreased by 28% for young adults coming from states with high spending on financial education when compared to their counterparts from low spending states. The third key finding is about the interaction. The effect of state-level spending on financial education varied by gender. Specifically, holding everything else constant, living in states with high spending on financial education was associated with a 35% lower risk of using AFS in male young adults. And this figure gives you a better sense of the interaction term, and it is the gender differences in the state level financial education spending AFS association. And this figure shows that compared to female young adults, states' high spending on financial education had a more substantial impact on decreasing AFS usage among male young adults. And this study has some limitations. First, this study only has one state level measure, so it ignores the heterogeneity within states, but there should be variations within states. Second, this study assumes that respondents in these studies stayed in the same states when they were in middle and high school, but there's possible domestic migration, but we cannot measure in using this data. The third limitation is there might be some unobserved effects like neighborhood effects that mentioned in many studies about AFS use. And lastly is state level laws regulating AFS policies and practices, which are also very important in predicting AFS use. But currently, Lou and I are thinking about a strategy to figure this one out, because this is very important for explaining the AFS use, and we are thinking about finding out a strategy to control for this. And we welcome suggestions and ideas from you, the audience, and we appreciate that if you have some suggestions for us. And here comes our conclusion. So although state investment in school financial education may reduce young adults' use of AFS, it has little help in alleviating the situation of those living with high financial burdens. And as you can see that controlling for financial education, the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics still show significant associations. Second, state-level financial education spending plays an important role in young adults AFS use. Specifically, the significant association appears only when state's annual spending reaches a certain point. In this study, more than $20 per student. It is reasonable because higher spending is likely linked to better financial education design and enhanced implementation, which may yield better financial behavior outcomes. Lastly, it remains unclear why it shows stronger effect on male young adults, but findings from this study call for state policies on investing in school financial education and highlighting program design and implementation that work inclusively across gender, race, and other demographic characteristics to help everyone make the use of these programs. And it also calls for immediate assistance to those who are financially struggling. And those are the references we use, and I leave my email here. So if you have any questions or further things to discuss, feel free to reach out and we can talk more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yingying. I'm curious just to open up for a Q&A. As a reminder, you can either raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can put your question in the chat box.
I saw Jeffrey.
Yep. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hi. Great work, Yingying. This is really interesting. You know, as I think about some of the difference between gender and the findings there, you know, one idea is if these are women and they also have children that are a part of the picture, then their ability to go to a bank may be significantly hindered by bank hours or, you know, kind of where the bank may be, especially if there is not one located in their particular area and neighborhood. And so there, you know, that's an additional logistical hurdle that they would need to address, that if the male does not have the children in tow, then, you know, that would be easier for him to be able to use a bank or credit union rather than having to just, you know, go wherever was closest.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, maybe you can also control for that or add that to the discussion point, because I think that's a good explanation for the differences. Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking to see if there was, I don't think zip code is available, but that would be an important controlling piece.
Yeah. That's also, that's why I said one of the limitation is
Right.
the unobserved, like neighborhood effect. That's very important in the AFS studies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Otherwise, great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Any other questions? Either raising your hand or putting in the chat box. I actually have one for you, Yingying. One question we ask in our post-webinar surveys is if the research presented will inform people's work moving forward. So I'm wondering if you could expand on the practical significance of your findings.
Yeah, I think one of the significant findings is about the exact amount of money we spend on school financial education rather than the binary variable, like if the states have the mandated policy or if the school has the financial education programs, because sometimes binary answers does not show any significance, but once they reach a certain amount of money, that may make some differences, and that's one of the things. And another point I want to discuss is the accessibility and of the programs. Some studies show that the school financial education programs may be more attractive to male students. I don't know exactly what they are talking about. Maybe more future programs could be designed by financial educators by integrating more interesting part that can interest female students as well. Yeah,
that's interesting. Thanks. I'm also curious about any other additional research questions that you'd be interested in researching next.
For the next, I think by the end of our fellowship program, I wrote one of the thing is we in this data set we have the time. So the state has the mandated financial education policy. So we can think about using a survival analysis to see by which time the states implemented that policy, if the timing matters for the individual financial behavior outcomes. And I'm thinking about that, but it's complicated, and I need some time to think about the detail. Yeah, I think the timing is also interesting topic to explore.
Interesting, thank you. Any other questions for Yingying before we pass it along to Thomas?
I saw Jeffrey has a comment. Build as investing, then I think that's. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. For student take up time.
Great. Well, if there are no further questions for Yingying, let's pass it along to Thomas. Great job, Yingying. Thank you again.
All right, thank you, Lauren. Please can you see my screen? All right, hi everyone, my name is Thomas, and thank you so much for taking part in our presentation. My research looks at the relationship between student loan debt and emergency savings, considering the role or the intermediation role of financial knowledge. We all know that emergency savings is very important in times of financial emergencies. To make things easier for us, let's even put aside illness and all those things. The recent COVID-19 pandemic has taught us about the need for having emergency fund. And usually financial planners or counselors recommend that married households have 3 months of financial of savings in emergency funds that could help them pay for expenses when the unexpected arises. For those who are single, normally we recommend about 6 months of having emergency funds that could take off the expenses when what is not expected happens. So having emergency fund is very important. If households do not have this, life could be difficult for them when the unexpected arises. And so there have been several studies in this area trying to understand what factors influence emergency savings. In particular, if you consider the statistics in the US, we see that many households actually do not have emergency savings. For example, recently the US Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had this Making Ends Meet survey, and that in that survey they found that about 25% of Americans do not have emergency savings. Even for those who have emergency savings, they find that 49% of them have emergency funds that could not last for even just a month. The FINRA Foundation also had a similar study, and they found that about 47% of Americans said that their emergency funds could not last for 3 months. So there's been several attempts to understand why this is happening. And what this study seeks to do is to look at the role of student loan debt in this particular situation. And so this study answers two main research questions. And the first one is that how does borrowing for college education relate to emergency saving decisions? And the second one is how does financial knowledge mediate the relationship between student debt and emergency saving decisions? At this point, permit me to say thank you to NEFE for the fellowship support. Permit me also to say thank you to the team from Knology and NEFE, for example, Jill, Sarah, Lauren, Johnny, Joseph, and Sean. Thanks for your support, and to my fellow team members, I want to say thank you for your support in making this project a better one. All right, now let's continue. I realized I missed that point. So to help me answer those two questions, I used data from two ways of the US Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making. As some of you may know, this data set collects data, or it's administered once a year, and so it's an annual data set. So far, they have so many ways of the data available, but it's so hard to determine which of the ways contain the kind of variables that you need. And so this is where the NEFE and Knology financial education database becomes important. The mapping tool in that database made it easier for me to look at all the ways and consider the ways which contain the variables of interest. And so using that database, I was able to determine that the two waves, 2018 and 2019 waves, are those that are adequate for me to carry out with this particular study. Now, my dependent variables is emergency savings. So if a household reports that they have funds that could take care of 3 months of their expenses, when the need arises, I code that one as 1, otherwise it's 0. The key variable of interest is student loan debt, and I code this as 1 if a household reports having a student debt on its balance sheet. And this could be student loan debt for the respondent or the respondent's spouse or children. Otherwise, I code it as 0. And I also have the moderating variable, which in this case is objective financial knowledge. I do not have information about other financial knowledge questions. And so I focus on the big 3 financial literacy questions by Lusadi and Mitchell. And these questions center on inflation, interest rates, and risk diversification. What I seek to do here is to sum the correct responses, allowing me to measure financial knowledge as a continuous variable. And based upon the theory and the literature, I include several control variables. I include bank account ownership, which is a proxy for financial inclusion. I include information about gender, age, race, credit card debt, and several other variables, educational attainment, and all that in the model. In this study, I estimate 4 models, and these models are estimated based on the study's objectives or research questions. The first model here is a restricted model, and so this model includes only student debt. The second one includes student debt and the control variables. The third one adds the financial knowledge variable to student debt and the control variables, and the fourth one includes the interaction term. In this study, I use odds ratios, and so as you know already, a value of 1 suggests a positive relationship, and a value of less than 1 indicates a negative relationship. In this study, I move beyond mere correlational analysis to account for self-selection bias, and so I have more interest in trying to establish causal relationship, and I do know that we have different views in this regard, but one thing for sure is that when it comes to student loan usage, there's been found that its uptake or its use is not random. So there's been differences regarding race, ethnicity, gender, financial knowledge, and even from my current research about people's personality traits. And all these could determine whether somebody uses a student debt or not. And so to help overcome this self-selection bias, I use 2 models. I use the propensity score matching analysis, and I also use causing exact matching techniques as treatment effect models to help me remove the self-selection bias and to obtain results that could be described as causal. Now, all that these two models seek to do is to ensure that we have similar observations for comparison purposes. Here are the descriptive statistics, and so here this is the summary stats for the raw sample. So this one, I didn't apply any matching technique to it. So what we do see here is that about 54% of the respondents said that they have set aside some money that could last them for at least 3 months when their need arises. For those with student debt, about 20% say they have student loan debt. Now, if you look at those with emergency savings and those without emergency savings, you do observe that households with emergency savings are less likely to hold student debt, right? So among those with emergency savings, about 40% have student debt, and among those without emergency savings, about 29% of them have student debt. If you look at financial knowledge, you see that the average score is about 1.87, but for those with emergency funds, the average score is 2, and this is higher than those without emergency funds, with an average score of 1.5. Here is the descriptives for the matched sample, and the key thing about the matched sample is that we didn't want to see any differences based on these covariates, right? And so the key thing here is the percent bias. The percent bias is useful for what they call covariant balance. A value below 10 suggests that the data could be described as, the data collection process could be described as random. In other words, self-selection bias is absent. And so we see that for these select variables, and of course for the other ones which I have not shown here, all the percent bias are below 10. That means that the element of self-selection bias is absent. And so now we have similar observations for the analysis. I also include a bit about the overlap test. The overlap test is very important in ensuring that the treatment effect model is successful. And so here we have the treated and the untreated. The treated observations are those who have student debt, and the untreated ones are those without student debt. And clearly you see that for every observation, we have the corresponding observation for the analysis. For example, if you take the untreated sample, we have the corresponding, if you take this sample here, we have the corresponding sample that will help in the analysis. So here are the regression results. The first one here is model 1, the model that is fully restricted. And clearly you see that there is a negative relationship between student debt and emergency savings. And we could explain this from different perspectives. Even economic theory would help us. We know that when people have student loan debt, they're always concerned about paying off this debt. They may have higher interest rate on this loan. And so their interest is to pay off this debt. And so that could limit their ability to save for financial emergencies. If we include the control variables, we see the same negative effect here as well. If we go ahead and include the financial knowledge variable, we still see that student debt has a negative effect on the likelihood of having emergency savings. Looking at the financial knowledge score, we do observe that higher financial knowledge increases the likelihood of holding emergency funds. And this is something that's really good and something that supports the existing literature. There's been so many studies in this area, and many of them have shown that financial knowledge is important for helping households save for financial emergencies. Now we have the interaction term. If you look at the interaction term, you still observe that okay, so let me take my time to explain this term very well. You see that the coefficient is negative, right? We have for the interaction term. But now if you consider those without student debt, okay, we see that they are more likely to save for financial emergencies. The coefficient in this case is 1.17 for the PSM and 1.21 for the CM. Now, if you consider households with student debt, then we need to multiply the coefficient for the financial knowledge and that of the interaction term. And so for the PSM, we see that the likelihood of saving financial emergencies is 1.0586. And so this is a positive relationship. What that means is that households with student debt tend to save for financial emergencies when as their financial knowledge increases. Okay, let me show you the graph to help you better understand what I'm talking about. In this graph, we have the top line for those without student debt and the red line or the line below for those with student debt. What we do observe is that for each unit increase in financial knowledge score, both of these groups are more likely to save for financial emergencies. However, the effect, of course, is stronger for those without student debt. That notwithstanding, we still do see that when households or when individuals' financial knowledge increases, they also tend to save for financial emergencies. They tend to understand the need to save for financial emergencies. So this is something that is remarkable and that is good. So both models give us similar plots about the moderating role of financial knowledge in motivating households with and without student debt to save for financial emergencies. That said, this paper has some limitations. Like I told you earlier on, we don't have information about all the objective financial knowledge questions. Again, we don't have information about the dollar values for student debt and emergency savings. Again, we are giving information about 3 months, whether you have funds that could last for 3 months or not. We all do know that some households may have funds that could last for 2 months or 1 month, especially those low-income households, right? So those things are good, at least it's better than nothing. However, this particular question ignores that sample, right? So again, when it comes to the model, there could be differences as to whether the treatment effects are adequate or not, but those are some limitations that may come with this study. That said, this paper has some implications. The first one is that we all know that student debt imposes financial constraints on holders, but it is always important that those who hold student debt understand that having student debt is just one aspect of their overall financial landscape. And so it is important that they do not focus on only that aspect, what we call narrow framing. They should rather consider their total financial picture or the bigger picture, instead of focusing only on one aspect, which prevents them or which does not allow them to consider their overall financial health. And so this is one area that financial educators could emphasize as they provide financial education to student debt holders. This study also supports previous studies that financial knowledge is important in helping households build emergency savings. That said, we know from the graph that I showed you, there is a large gap in the likelihood of saving for emergencies for those with and without student debt. So although there are gains from financial knowledge, we do see that there is still a wide gap. And so this finding suggests that it is important that we provide avenues for those with student debt to continuously receive financial education, right? So not just before, but during and even after, they need to continuously receive financial education to help them improve their knowledge and to also help them plan well for their financial future, which includes saving for financial emergencies. We can talk about several implications. For example, we can bring in the income-driven repayment plans, right? The good thing about this income-driven repayment plan is that it helps households to pay part of their student debt based on what they can afford, and that this could also help them to take off their other financial lives instead of simply focusing on paying off their student debts and neglecting the other part of their financial lives. I do know that private student loans do not offer income-driven repayment plans, but this is something that could be looked at in the future, helping student debt holders manage their lives, both in the short term and in the long term. All right, thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate you taking part in this presentation. This is my email address. Please contact me if you need further information.
Thank you, Thomas. Great job. Any questions for Thomas? Again, you can raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. To kick us off, I guess I would ask, what excites you most about the results of your research?
Yeah, so I have used, we all use, well, I use the loan there to help me pay for my college education, which of course I'm grateful for, but I spent just a few years to pay them off. And so there's been so many studies that have found that student loan debt, of course, the loan is good to help you get college education, but it has several negative effects on households, right? And I was happy to see that with financial knowledge, there is hope. There's hope, right? There's hope. And so that is something that really excites me about this. Yeah.
That's great. Looks like there's a question from Jeffrey. He asked, do I remember that you mentioned the size of the debt wasn't available? If you can parse out levels of student debt that may show significant differences between those who have to pay student loans as a small bill and those who are truly burdened by it.
That's true. Yeah.
I guess I'd also ask the same question that I asked Yingying, but just what are some additional investigations or research questions that you'd like to pursue next?
Yeah, great question. So I wanted to also look at the financial education mandates and state level spending and how it's influencing young adults' emergency saving behavior. And that's one area that I have interest in that I could not do for this particular project. And it is something that I want to do next. Yeah.
Great. Just to interrupt real quickly, I am dropping, I am dropping the link to our survey about this webinar. Really appreciate any participants on this call filling that out. If you are a NEFE staff member, please refrain from filling this out, just to not skew our results. Any other questions that I can take for Thomas? If not, it looks like there's some people dropping off, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, Solomon. And thank you to our presenters. It's been great to work with you all. And yeah, great presentations today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.